1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. A date etched in history, the moment America was discovered by Europeans. Or was it? What if I told you that almost 500 years before Columbus, another group of legendary seafarers, warriors, and explorers from the icy north had already set foot on North American soil? We're talking, of course, about the Vikings. Today, we're diving deep into the sagas, the archaeological evidence, and the incredible story of how Vikings reached America and why their chapter in this land was so different from what came later. But before we cross the vast Atlantic with them, we must first understand who these people were, the world they came from, and the relentless westward drive that propelled them to the very edges of the known world. Buckle up, this is a journey back in time. Welcome to Old Around the World, where we travel back in time to bring historical events back to life. Our story begins in Scandinavia, a land of dramatic contrasts, deep fjords carving through towering mountains, dense forests, a harsh northern climate, and a long, intricate coastline that beckoned its people to the sea. It was from this crucible of earth and water, during a period spanning roughly from the late 8th to the early 11th century, that the people we call Vikings emerged to profoundly impact the course of European history and eventually to touch the shores of a new continent. The term Viking itself is somewhat fluid. To go a Viking often meant to go on an overseas expedition, typically for raiding or trading. For centuries, the popular image of the Viking was that of a horned-helmeted, a myth, by the way, axe-wielding barbarian, descending from the mist to pillage and burn. While raiding was undoubtedly a significant aspect of their activity, particularly in the early Viking Age, this stereotype belies a far more complex and sophisticated society. They were farmers, poets, skilled craftsmen, merchants who established vast trade networks, and, most importantly for our story, peerless navigators and explorers. Scandinavian society was hierarchical, led by chieftains or jarls, who commanded loyalty through prowess in battle, wisdom in counsel, and generosity. Below them were the carls, the freemen who formed the backbone of society, farmers, artisans, and warriors. At the bottom were thralls or slaves. Kinship and honor were paramount. Disputes were often settled at regional assemblies called things, where freemen gathered to make laws and dispense justice. Their worldview was steeped in a rich Norse mythology, a belief system that undoubtedly fueled their adventurous and often daring spirit. But what truly enabled the Vikings to project their influence so far and wide was their mastery of shipbuilding. The Viking longship was a technological marvel of its age, clinker-built with overlapping hull planks, creating a strong yet remarkably flexible structure that could ride the fierce Atlantic waves. Possessing a shallow draft, these ships could navigate in waters just a meter deep, sail up rivers, and make surprise landings on beaches. Propelled by a large, square woolen sail and rows of oars, they were fast, versatile, and capable of carrying significant numbers of warriors or cargo over vast distances. Their navigational skills were equally impressive, especially considering they lacked modern instruments like the compass. They relied on an intimate knowledge of the sea, keen observation of the sun, stars, bird flight patterns, marine mammals, wave patterns, and even the color and temperature of the water. What spurred the Viking Age, this sudden explosion of activity? The traditional start date is often cited as 793 AD, with the raid on Lindisfarne. But the causes were multifaceted: overpopulation and land scarcity in parts of Scandinavia, political consolidation driving some to seek independence elsewhere, and the powerful lure of wealth. Early raids revealed the riches of Western Europe, but beyond raiding, trade was vital. Vikings established extensive trade networks connecting Northern Europe with Byzantium, the Arab world, the British Isles, and Frankish kingdoms. This outward impulse, this potent combination of land hunger, political pressure, economic ambition, a spirit of adventure, and the technological means, inevitably turned Viking eyes westward. Their first significant steps led them to the Faroe Islands, settled likely in the early 9th century. The next great leap was to Iceland. According to the Landnámabók, the Book of Settlements, the island was first accidentally sighted around 860 AD. Systematic settlement began in earnest around 870 AD, with Ingolfur Arnarsson traditionally considered the first permanent settler, founding Reykjavik. Over the next 60 years, a wave of settlers, primarily from Norway, populated Iceland's coasts, seeking land and freedom. By 930 AD, they established the Althing, a national assembly, making Iceland a remarkably advanced commonwealth. But the Viking spirit was not sated. The next, and arguably most challenging, step westward was to Greenland. Its systematic exploration and settlement are inextricably linked with Eric the Red. Banished from Iceland for killings around 982 AD, Eric explored Greenland's southwestern coast, finding areas that, during the medieval warm period, offered enough pasturage for Norse farming. Upon his return to Iceland, Eric, a masterful promoter, dubbed the new land Greenland to entice settlers. In 985 or 986 AD, he led a fleet, of which only 14 of 25 ships completed the perilous voyage, to establish two main settlements, the eastern and western settlements. Life in Norse Greenland was a constant struggle. Agriculture was marginal. They relied on animal husbandry and, crucially, hunting seals, caribou, and walruses for their valuable ivory, which they traded for essential goods like iron and timber. Despite the challenges, the Norse Greenlanders persevered for nearly 500 years. Their isolated settlements, at the very fringe of the European world, became the ultimate staging post for one final, audacious leap westward. The echoes of these pioneering voyages were preserved through a vibrant oral tradition, eventually written down in 13th and 14th century Iceland as the Icelandic Sagas. These prose narratives blend historical events with folklore and heroic legend. For our journey to North America, two sagas are paramount: the Saga of the Greenlanders and the Saga of Eric the Red. Though differing in details, together they tell of Norse encounters with lands west of Greenland. Our story of the Westward sighting, according to the Saga of the Greenlanders, begins with an accidental discovery by a merchant seaman named Bjarni Herjolfsson around 986 AD. Sailing from Iceland to join his father in Greenland, Bjarni was blown off course by a storm. For many days, he and his crew sailed blind. When the weather cleared, they found themselves within sight of an unfamiliar land, not mountainous, and covered with forest. Clearly not Greenland, Bjarni chose not to land, focused on reaching his father. Turning northeastward, they sighted a second land, flat and wooded, and again sailed on. A third land appeared, high and mountainous, with a glacier upon it. Still deeming it not their destination, they pressed on and finally reached Greenland. Bjarni's story stirred interest and criticism. He was censured for his lack of curiosity. One who took particular note was Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red. Bold and ambitious, Leif was captivated by tales of lands rich in resources Greenland lacked, especially timber. Around the year 1000 AD, Leif bought Bjarni's ship and gathered a crew of 35. His father, Eric, initially agreed to lead but, after an accident, took it as an omen and withdrew. So, Leif Erikson set sail from Greenland, determined to retrace Bjarni's route. The first land Leif encountered was Bjarni's last, high, mountainous, and glacier-covered. Leif went ashore, found a landscape of flat rocks, and named it Helgeland, land of flat stones, likely Baffin Island. Sailing south, they came upon another land, flat and wooded with white sandy beaches, which Leif named Markland, forest land, probably Labrador. Pressing further for 2 more days, they sighted a third land. They sailed into a sound, and their ship went aground at low tide. So eager were they to explore that they ran ashore where a river flowed out of a lake. Once the tide rose, they brought their ship into the lake and set up temporary shelters, deciding to overwinter. The land was bountiful, with large salmon and a mild climate. They built more substantial houses, Leifspear or Leif's booths. One day, Turker, a German in Leif's crew, found Vinvok Vinberg grapevines and grapes. Based on this, Leif named the country Vinland, wineland, or perhaps pasture land. Come spring, their ship laden with timber and dried grapes or berries, Leif Erikson and his crew returned triumphantly to Greenland. Leif's success earned him the nickname Leif the Lucky, and the tales of Vinland's riches spread, paving the way for others. Leif's successful return from Vinland ignited a fever of excitement. The first to follow, around 1004 AD, was Leif's brother, Thorvald Eriksson. He borrowed Leif's ship and reached Leifsbutter, wintering there. Exploring the following spring, his party found no human habitation save for a wooden corn shed. The next spring, exploring eastward, they encountered 3 skin boats with 9 natives concealed beneath. Thorvald's men attacked, killing 8. 1 escaped. Soon after, a large number of natives, whom the Norse called Skrælings, attacked the Vikings. Thorvald was mortally wounded by an arrow. His men buried him at a place he wished to be called Crossanes, then returned to Leifsbutter for a third winter before sailing back to Greenland with timber, vines, and grim news. Thorvald's death deeply affected his brother, Thorstein Erikson. He set out with his wife, Gudrid Thorbjarnardóttir, to retrieve Thorvald's body, but their expedition was caught in storms and tossed about the Atlantic all summer, eventually landing back in Greenland. Thorstein and many of his crew died of disease that winter. Despite these tragedies, Vinland's allure persisted. Around 1010 AD, Thorfinn Karlsefni, a wealthy Icelandic merchant, arrived in Greenland. Captivated by the prospects, he married Gudrid, Thorstein's widow, and mounted a major expedition to establish a permanent colony, with perhaps 3 ships and around 160 people, including women and livestock. They successfully reached Leifsbutter. The first winter was relatively easy. It was during this period that Gudrid gave birth to a son, Snorri Thorfinnsson, the first European child known to have been born in North America. One morning, a large group of Skraelings appeared, interested in trade. They offered furs for Norse goods, particularly red cloth. Karlsefni forbade trading weapons. For a time, trade flourished, but the relationship was fragile. According to one account, a Norse bull frightened the Skraelings, who retreated. 3 weeks later, they returned in force, attacking the settlement. The Norsemen were forced to retreat. It was then, according to the saga of Eric the Red, that Freydís Eriksdóttir, Leif's heavily pregnant sister, rallied the fleeing Norsemen. Grabbing a sword, she bared her breast and slapped it with the flat of the blade, a sight that so terrified the Skraelings they fled. Despite Freydís' bravery, Karlsefni realized that life in Vinland would be one of perpetual strife. After 3 winters, he abandoned the settlement and returned to Greenland. The saga of the Greenlanders recounts another, darker Vinland expedition led by the same Freydís. She partnered with 2 Icelandic brothers, Helgi and Finnbogi. Upon reaching Leifsbutter, Freydís, through deceit, engineered a feud, goading her husband and men into murdering the brothers and all their men. When her men refused to kill the 5 women in the brothers' party, Freydís herself allegedly took an axe and killed them. She returned to Greenland rich, but rumors of her deeds reached Leif. Though horrified, he did not directly punish his sister but predicted her descendants would not prosper. These sagas paint a complex picture. While Vinland was rich, the challenges, native resistance, vast distances, internal conflicts proved insurmountable. The dream of a new home in the West faded. For centuries, these dramatic stories were all that remained. But were they just epic tales? Or was there concrete truth buried beneath North American soil? For nearly 1,000 years, Vinland existed primarily in legend. The sagas were often viewed with skepticism. Generations tried to match saga descriptions with actual locations, proposing sites from New England to Labrador. Several purported Viking artifacts surfaced but were mostly debunked. The mystery remained until the mid-20th century, when Helga Ingstad, an explorer, and Stein Ingstad, an archaeologist, embarked on a quest. They meticulously studied the sagas, focusing their search on Newfoundland and Labrador. In 1960, in northern Newfoundland, a local fisherman, George Decker, led Helga Ingstad to peculiar grassy mounds near aux Meadows, Jellyfish Cove. To Ingstad, their layout resembled Norse ruins. In 1961, Stein Ingstad began excavations. Over 7 years, they uncovered the remains of a small settlement. Beneath the mounds lay foundations of at least 8 buildings, 3 large multi-roomed longhouses of Norse style and smaller huts. The artifacts were compelling. Hundreds of iron boat nails and rivets, a bronze ring-headed pin of Viking Age design, a soapstone spindle whorl indicating textile production, and most decisively, a smithy with a stone anvil and slag, definitive proof of ironworking. Radiocarbon dating consistently dated the occupation of aux Meadows to around 1000 AD, precisely the period of the Vinland sagas. This was not a large agricultural colony, but likely a base camp for overwintering, repairing ships, and staging expeditions. The discovery provided the first universally accepted archaeological proof of a Norse presence in North America. In 1978, aux Meadows was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site. While aux Meadows confirms a Norse presence, its exact identification within the saga narrative, Leifsbutter, Hop, or Stromfur, is debated. What is certain is that it was a vital foothold. But if they made it here, why didn't they stay? The answer points to a confluence of formidable challenges. Firstly, conflict with the indigenous Skraelings. The Norse were always a tiny minority, and the threat of attack was constant. Secondly, the sheer distance and isolation from Greenland and Scandinavia made supply lines and reinforcement immense undertakings. Thirdly, the expeditions involved limited numbers, insufficient to establish a self-sustaining population or defend against threats. Fourth, internal conflicts and lack of unified purpose, as hinted in the sagas, may have hampered efforts. Finally, climate change likely played a role. The medieval warm period, which aided their expansion, gave way to the Little Ice Age, making conditions in Greenland untenable and North Atlantic voyages more treacherous. A failing Greenland colony could no longer support ventures in Vinland. Thus, a combination of these factors made long-term Norse settlement in North America unsustainable. The Vinland experiment, bold as it was, eventually withered. So, the Vikings, led by explorers like Leif Erikson, were indeed the first documented Europeans to reach North America, establishing a settlement at aux Meadows around 1000 AD, nearly 5 centuries before Columbus. Their voyages were extraordinary feats. However, the Viking discovery differed profoundly from that of Columbus. The Norse voyages were an extension of their westward expansion. Their settlements in North America were small, short-lived, and failed to establish a permanent European presence or a lasting connection between the two hemispheres. Their discovery became a kind of historical dead end in terms of continuous European engagement. And it's crucial, always, to remember that North America was far from undiscovered. It was a continent teeming with diverse cultures and millions of indigenous peoples who had inhabited these lands for millennia. For them, the arrival of Norsemen, and later, much larger waves of Europeans, marked the beginning of profound transformations. The legacy of the Vikings in North America is a testament to their incredible capabilities. aux Meadows stands as irrefutable proof of their reach. Yet, their impact on the long-term historical trajectory of the Americas was minimal compared to the changes initiated from 1492 onwards. The story of Vinland reminds us that history is often more complex and surprising than simplified versions. It challenges us to look beyond familiar narratives and appreciate the incredible journeys of the past.